Hi there. So today what we're going to be looking at is how we can convert our database that we set up in Azure under MySQL to SQL Server. We're actually not going to convert it. We're actually just going to create a new SQL Server database. So the very first thing we're going to do is get the database set up in Azure. So before, what we did was run the database locally, and then we eventually moved it to Azure. We're just going to start with Azure right out of the gate as a beginning point. So in your Azure portal, go to SQL Databases, select Add, and put the database name in. So something like that. We're going to create a new one. And I'm actually going to have it create, so what this is going to do is create the database server, and I'm going to actually have it also create the Sample AdventureWorks LT database, which is an e-commerce database or a commerce database. We're going to use this to look at some more in-depth examples in REST coming up. We won't look at it in this example, but I wanted to show or get it started with this, and then we'll go ahead and create a new database is what we're going to do. Okay, so we need to configure a pricing tier. So the server name is this is the server name that's going to be available on the internet. So obviously these names don't matter. You can put whatever you want. Your admin login, whatever you want that to be. You won't see my password, which is probably a good thing. You pick where you want it to run. I'm going to do West Central. And this is complaining it's already in use, so let's try a different one. And we may have a tough time finding a name. You'll notice it just, so I liked 0. How about A? So 0, 1. Let's do that. Nope. So we'll just pick a database name. It doesn't really matter what it is. If you're setting stuff up in production, obviously you're going to care a lot more about the names than we do here. Okay, so that's what we're going to set up. It will keep track of all that. We'll use this resource group name, which was already out there. Actually, let's do this. Let's create a new one. And then the pricing tier. Let's go look at what are what things are available to us. We're going to actually use basic, which gives us 5 DTUs. It'll explain to you what a DTU is here. It's essentially $4.99 a month for 100 megabytes to 2 gigabytes. So that's what our monthly cost is going to be on this. Remember, that's the database server cost. And so with all that, we're going to go ahead and hit create. I'm going to pause the recording while this creates because it will take a few minutes to do this. So I'm going to go ahead and hit create, and then we'll come back. Okay, it's done creating, so let's do a refresh here and we should see our database. So there it is, database 11, it's online. And so let's click on this and we can see some of the settings that we may need. The first thing we need is the server name. And we're going to come back and get the connection strings here in just a minute, but we're going to copy that, and then we're going to launch SQL Server Management Studio, or SSMS. I actually have a video out there on using SQL Server, or a set of videos. I think there's about 12 of them if you'd like to look at those if you're new to SQL Server. But SQL Server Management Studio is a management tool that lets us manage SQL Server databases. And we are going to put in this database and its SQL Server authentication, and our admin password, or password to get into this, was manage database. And the password. So we'll let it connect. So this is running locally, and it's basically saying, hey, your client IP doesn't have access to the server. Sign into an Azure account. So you want to sign in with the same Azure account that you were using. Once you do this once, you won't have to do it again, but so I'm actually using a brand new Azure account, so all of the things that we did before were not there. Well, they're still there, but they're not running. And we're going to go ahead and let this configure for us. Okay, so now I'm running SQL Server Management Studio locally, and I'm connected up to Azure, to my database in Azure, the database server. And the nice thing about this is now I can go ahead and create new databases, I can manage the tables, I can run queries, all within this without having to do it through code. So the first thing I'm going to do is we're going to create a new database out there called EmployeeDB. And again, if this takes a few minutes, I'll pause the recording while it goes. It takes a little bit for it to connect back up to Azure each time on this. Here's our database name. So what we're going to do is set up the database that we were using before in MySQL, and we are going to use that. I'm not going to do a whole lot with accounts on this as far as setting up different accounts. You can get into SQL Server on how to do that. But we'll set up the new database and we'll put our table in there that we were using. Alright, we can see our database is created here. We can also see, if we expand this, that we don't have any tables that we've created. So we're going to create a new table. This is going to be our table personnel. And it has the same column names that we've been using. Things are a little different in SQL Server than they are in MySQL. And we're going to have to make some code changes that we'll go over real quickly. But we'll just set these up real quick. Again, there's videos out there that you can get on more about SQL Server if you're interested in that. It's a great database system that will handle large amounts of data, and many businesses run off of SQL Server. I've used it for many years in production systems. It works great. It's easy to use. It's got good tools. So we have our dates, and we're going to make these date time. And we'll make this one date time as well. And then there's a few things we need to do. We don't want to allow nulls on these. I don't remember if we did that or not on the other one. This one we want to be an identity field. In other words, we want it to automatically be being populated by the database itself. So we're going to tell it that this is an identity field, and we are also going to make this the primary key. So we'll set that as the primary key. So there's our table, and with that we can close this, and we want to say yes, and the table name is TBL personnel. Oops. Spell that exactly the same as we had it, so we don't have to make too many code changes. Having code that refers to tables and columns directly is not generally a good idea, and as we get into more advanced topics with our REST service, you'll get to see how we can approach that. So there's our table that's now created. If I right click on this and do select top 100 rows or 1000 rows, you'll see that it's going out to Azure, to the Azure database server, and there's no data in this yet. Okay. All right, so our database is now set up. If we jump back over to Azure and refresh, you'll see that the employee DB database is now up. And we need to look at the connection strings that are associated with this. And it gives you some different versions here, and we're using the ADO.NET one, and so we're just going to grab that. And what we are going to do is well, we'll come back to this in just a minute once we get our code deploying, okay? So we want to set up our connection here locally in our settings. So let's start our code up here. And what we want to bring up is this project. This is where we left off with authentication that we were working on. So we're just adding to this. So this is kind of a pivotal point in our learning, because we're going to be switching over to SQL Server, and we're going to be using a more complicated database after this video. All right, so all of our changes are going to be in basically a couple of different places. One is in our database connections configuration. We're actually not, we could run against the database. So there's a couple of different ways we can do this. One is we can have the server running locally talking to the Azure database, because we didn't set up a local database. I could set up a local SQL Server database and run everything locally. That's another option. The code will be the same no matter what you do. You'll just change the connection string. Or I can have the code running and the database running in Azure, and that's really where we're going to get to. So we're going to we could take an intermediate step of running the server locally and pointing it to the Azure database. We're just going to go ahead and skip that and just move right on to using Azure for everything. Okay, so our changes are mainly going to be in person persistence, because this is where we have all of our MySQL code. And so instead of MySQL data, we're going to be, this is what you need to do the same type of thing in SQL Server. So the SQL client is what we want. So using system data, SQL client, that's going to give us everything that we need. And then any place you see any place you see MySQL, we're going to need to replace that, okay? And so this all gets replaced with just a SQL connection. So I am going to do I am going to be doing a search and replace on this. So we're going to do find and replace. So we're going to do a quick replace, and we're going to go, all of those we want replaced with just SQL connection. Okay. And we'll just have it replace them all. So it replaced 12 of them. Okay, so that takes care of our connection. Our connection string is still looking for local DB. We'll configure that on Azure again. If you remember, we did that in a previous video. Okay, the next thing is the MySQL data reader. And we're going to replace that with a SQL data reader. You'll notice how close the code is here. It makes it very, very easy to make these type of changes. I'm going to leave this as MySQL reader, which will be fine. And then this whole thing here, which is MySQL data, MySQL client, MySQL command, we're going to replace that with just SQL command. Replace all of those. Okay, because I left MySQL reader alone as an object, we can go ahead and use that throughout the code. So we have one error down here it's complaining about. Okay, so we were counting on basically determining what the last ID was inserted as and returning that. And we need to do that a little bit differently in SQL. So when you have an identity field like this and it is automatically adding the data for you, setting that value for you, then you need to return that value back from this call. So in other words, if I insert a new record, what I want this to do is I want it to tell, I want the return of the function to be that value. So for example, if I add a new row and it sets the ID to 5, then I want to return 5. That's the whole idea here. So I apologize if that's not really clear. If you've worked with identity fields before, it probably makes sense. Okay. All right, so here's what we need to do. Again, we have a lot of code in here that's directly tied to the database, and that's not, in general, a very good practice. And we're going to add a little bit more in here. So we're going to add an additional statement that says select scope identity. What this does is it finds the identity value that was just added, and it will return it as part of this call. But what that means is we have to execute this differently. With the driver for MySQL, we could use this last inserted ID. We can't do that with SQL Server the same way. And so instead of command execute non-query, we're going to get a decimal type, and we're going to say the ID is equal to, and instead of command execute non-query, it's going to be execute scalar. And what that's saying is we expect this SQL call to return a single value, and that will be loaded into ID, and then we can simply return ID cast to a long. So again, what I did here at the end of this statement was I added a semicolon and then select scope identity paren semicolon. That causes this SQL command to return a value, and the value that's going to be returned is the ID that was just inserted, the ID that was set when this row was inserted. Okay. All right, the other thing we have to do is fix this MySQL exception business. And we could use a SQL exception. I'm just going to do a general exception on this for now. So we'll change all those. And I believe that's everything that we need to change. We'll find out here as we run this and see. Okay? So I took all of my code now, all of my code's modified to use SQL Server instead of using MySQL. Okay. So the problem that we have right now is we could throw all this up in Azure and test it, but we haven't learned how to debug in Azure yet. I probably ought to do a video on that. Right now, what we're going to do is go ahead and set this up to run locally. Okay, so let me do that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab the connection string right here. And this has all the information that I need about the server. And then I'll go ahead and run the service locally, and it'll be hitting the database over Azure. And I am not going to show you the user ID and password that I'm going to type in here, so you already know that this one is managed database. And I'll probably change these just so that we keep secure. And I'm going to type in my password. I'll pause. I'm going to type my password in. I'll pause, and then I'll come back. I'm actually going to put these in single quotes. So I'll pause this. I'll type my password in, and then we'll kind of hide it so you don't see it directly. Okay, so the password's set there, and we should be able to run this locally and see what happens. So let's do that. While it's doing that, I'm going to bring up Postman. So it's going to build and run this. And we just have one little thing, a couple little things we need to do on Azure, and we should have everything working, and we can run through and test our different verbs. I know this video is running a little bit long, but hopefully this makes sense what we're doing. Don't need to use Conveyor right now. Okay, and if we go ask for people, it's still coming up here. So I'll pause this for a second. Everything's coming up. So I had a breakpoint set. I'm going to clear that and just hit continue. Let's jump over to Postman. And it brought back nothing. And that's true because we don't have anything on our database in Azure. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go poke some data into Azure. So I'm going to just do an edit on this. Remember, this is running in the cloud. So I'm going to just put one value in here real quick. This will let us test to make sure that all of our code's working properly. Oops. Didn't get that data in there right. You'll notice that it automatically put ID in for me. Okay, now if I run this again, I should get that data back. All right, I got a problem with casting here. This is why we wanted to run this locally and test it out. Make sure that it's working properly. Okay, double pay rate's coming back as a double, and so I'm gonna just change this to say get double. That's really the problem. And I think everything else should still be okay. So now I'll need to go through and change that all the way through. I'd ask you to remind me to do that, but this isn't a two-way conversation, unfortunately. Okay, so that's coming up. It's really slow coming up for some reason. Might be time to get a faster, newer computer. There's our data, so it came back okay. So that's good. So let's stop this, and let's go fix that everywhere. So any place I'm getting float, I need to get double. That's just a typing issue between MySQL and SQL Server, and you're going to run into those little incompatibilities as you move between database management systems. Okay, so that's all good. Let me run it again one more time. I'm going to just do a couple of little tests here locally. I'm going to go on faith that our post, our put, and our delete are all working. I'm going to play around with the get just a little bit just to see if there's anything else I need to just try real quick. So let me do that. So we already know that I can do this and get data back. I think this is because I have Conveyor still running that it's taken a while to launch. Remember, Conveyor was the thing that allowed us to develop an Android app outside of this operating system and be able to call into it. And let you call in actually from different operating systems. You may know that I'm developing this on a Mac. Running Parallels, Windows 10 and Parallels. Okay, so let's go after person 1 this way. That comes back okay. If I ask for person 14, ID 14, I get a not found. And we'll let that continue out. Okay, so that's okay. Looks like we need to work on our return type there. I'm not going to worry about that just right now. Okay, so let's move on and let's go ahead and deploy this up to Azure. So as I told you, I was doing this on I'm doing this on a new account. So let me publish, and we're going to do a new profile. And I don't want this account. I'm switching accounts, so we'll do that. And we're going to call this Simple REST Server 5. And it wants me to re-enter my credentials, so I'll do that real quick. Once again, you get these accounts all lined up, it goes pretty quickly. You don't have to keep doing this once you're set up for development. I've just switched to a new Azure account, so this is all new up there. Okay, so that's happy. Partner, all this came up okay. That all looks good. I'm going to hit create. So you'll watch down here it's deploying. So it's deploying up to Azure. And I'll pause while it's doing this. Okay, so it was successful. I jump back over here to Azure and look at all of my resources. I should now have a simple REST Server 5 out there. Right here. That's great. Now, one thing I need to do is put the database connection string as an app setting. And if you'll remember that the reason we do this is so that we actually don't have to have the connection string information in our app at all locally. We don't have to have it checked into version control. We can just set it up here at the server. That's under the application settings of the web server. And if I scroll down here to the connection strings, I want to call it the same as what it's called in this config file. And let me pause just a second because I'm going to be going across the password here. So the name of it's local DB. So if I set this up on Azure, what will happen is as soon as it sees this, it'll look locally on Azure for the setting. So local DB. I've already grabbed the value. I already copied it. I'm just going to paste it in here. It's a SQL database. And that's it. And I'm going to save that. So now everything should run locally, or local to Azure. So both the web service, the RESTful web service, and the database are all up in the cloud now. So we can try it out. And we're going to do that by doing this. So everything is up there and running. And this shows me the URL that I need to use. So I'm going to grab this and put it in Postman. So this is already running, and we'll just kind of watch what happens here. So instead of localhost, we will replace this with this URL, and we will ask it to go get me all the people. That's not good. So I need to go debug that. It says the resource you're looking for has been removed, had its name changed, or is temporarily unavailable. It's a 404 not found. So it can't actually find that. So we'll pause there. It may not be up all the way yet, so we'll just kind of watch this. So what it did was I went and just hit publish again, and now I got the page saying that it published. So I'm not sure that it published that first time for some reason. So I'm not sure what exactly happened there. We'll try this again and see if we have any better luck. Oh, well, doing a delete is not what we want to do. Okay, so there's a get. Maybe that was the problem as I was doing the delete. So, I do a get on the person, and I get on person one, and all that works fine. So let's do this. How about we try a post, and let's add a new record. So it doesn't matter what the ID is because it's going to be ignored. So let's do Smith, Bobby, and I won't change any of the other data. That's enough for us to at least see. That's JSON. So let's go back over here and do our get on all of our people. And there we go. That added properly. And then what I'm going to do is just copy this tab in Postman. So I'm going to duplicate this. Instead of doing post, we'll do a put. So remember, a put will let us update. So let's say we wanted to change that pay rate like this. So now we're testing our put. We can jump back over here and get all the data and make sure that it all came back okay. So that looks good. And let's duplicate this one more time. And this time we'll do another post. So instead of a put, we'll do a post. So this will add another Bobby Smith in. And if we do a get on that, now we have 3, and we have 1 duplicated. So I did that on purpose so that I can test the delete. And delete just wants to know which one we want to delete. Okay. And so we want to delete, let's say we want to delete 3. So I just put that on the URL and send it. So I should have 2 records in there now, which I do. So we've managed to get SQL Server up and running in Azure. We're going to use that as a way to move into a more complete example of using RESTful web services. And we also modified our code so that it works with SQL Server. So hopefully this was useful to you. I'm sorry for the length. Please watch the other videos that are out there. There's a whole playlist around REST. There's another playlist around SQL Server. So enjoy, and please keep liking the videos if you like them, and put comments in. Those help support these so that we can continue to do them. Thanks.